You know, it's tempting to think sometimes that when it comes to the gospel story and the events of the death of Jesus, his final day there in Jerusalem, it's tempting to think that because we often see it in television, we see it in movies and sort of efforts to kind of reinterpret the event as what happened back then, 2,000 years ago, is often in our minds, we have this idea that Jesus died up on a hill, a cross, kind of up high. Not that many people around. I think most of the paintings and things I've seen through the years. But if we were to get an accurate picture of Jesus' death, we would have seen him, on the side of the road. There would have been crowds and crowds of people that had come. They were there when he rode in on Jerusalem. They were there that morning at the trial, and the Gospels tells us that the whole city was aware of what was going on. In fact, a couple of days later on Sunday, on Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday, not everybody knew that he had been raised from the dead. Two of his disciples they're walking down the road, going to a little village outside Jerusalem called Emmaus, and Jesus starts walking with them. They don't know it's Jesus at first. And Jesus is kind of coy. He says, what are you guys talking about? And of course, they're talking about what's happened. And they look at Jesus and not realizing it's him, and they say, are you the only person who's been traveling to Jerusalem that hasn't heard about what's happened? In other words, this was something everybody was talking about. And if they had Jerusalem News, is the title of our series that we continue today, if they would have had breaking news, if they would have had Twitter, if they would have had live cable television with the lower thirds with a running bar of headlines running across it, that morning it would have started with, as we talked about last week, Jesus crucified. As the Romans handed him over, they crucified him as he had walked outside the gates. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross, and on the side of the road between two thieves, two rebels, Jesus is crucified. That would have been major news. Everyone would have been watching. Everyone would have been paying attention. Everyone would have been looking at this. But today we see the next major headline event. And if we had been there when this had happened and they would have had the technology we do today, you can bet this would have been the headline. It would have simply read, Jesus dead. Can't you imagine waking up Saturday morning and opening up the newspaper in Jerusalem? And it has that headline in all bold, big print, Jesus dead, and all that means. Well, what Mark, the gospel writer, does for us is he gives us this kind of an account. He describes to us, like a good news reporter, the events that will happen on this day that Jesus dies. And today we're going to pick up there in Mark chapter 15, in verse 33, the way Mark tells the story, because Mark's going to focus on some things that are important. Like a news journalist doesn't tell you about everything that's happening. They just tell you about the things that are seemingly important. And this is what Mark does for us. It starts in verse 33 when it says, at noon. At noon. So he was crucified at 9 a.m. This is 3 hours later. It's noon. By the way, most days here in Texas, when it's noon, you can look up in the sky and the sun is standing just about in the middle of the sky. It's as bright as any other part of the day, right? Because the sun is in the center of the sky. Look what it says. At noon, darkness came over the whole land. It's the brightest time of the day, but it's suddenly dark. Until 3 in the afternoon, 3 hours of darkness. At 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. Mark records it in the language spoken by the people of Israel at the time, the Aramaic language, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near, see, there was a crowd of people, right? Heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. You may not understand this moment because last time we talked about how Jesus refused to drink wine that was offered to him. But this is not that. This is a sour wine that really is made up of vinegar, water, and eggs. Doesn't that sound yummy? That is the kind of an original protein kind of drink. It's an energy drink. It was literally something that Roman soldiers would drink to get renewed energy. And in fact, what it does, instead of lessening the severity of the cross, it lengthens it by giving him this renewed sense of energy. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. And at this point, it almost sounds like mockery when they say, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Verse 37, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Most of the time that I've seen it, and maybe you as well, when people die, they don't breathe loudly. They breathe softly, and they pass quietly. This is an indication of something significant that's happening here, that Jesus would cry out as he would breathe his last. Verse 38, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from, and notice this, the top to the bottom. In other words, somebody would get in there with some scissors and start, cutting their way up. This came from the top to the bottom. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. If he was speaking Latin, which he probably was, he would have said the Divi Filius. If he looked in his pocket and pulled out a coin, it would have had the name of the Roman emperor on it. Divi Filius, the Son of God. Surely this man was the Son of God. Now, verse 40, the gospel tells us some women were watching from a distance. So here's another crowd that's there, right? Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger. The old translation calls him James the Lesser. How'd you like to be called the Lesser? It really has to do with his age, and so this is a more accurate translation, James the Younger, and of Joseph and of Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed Jesus, and they had cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. I mean, these are crowds of people that are there, and including them are all these women who had come from Galilee. This is the scene that the gospel wants us to understand today. Now, as Mark writes this, he could have mentioned, any number of things that happened, but he chose to share these details with us. And he wants to begin like this, with something that was truly a newsworthy moment: darkness at midday. If today, when we walk out of this service, it's checking my watch just to see, it's 11:41. If we walked out of here and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, but suddenly it became dark, we would all be saying to ourselves, what's going on? And if it lasted for 3 hours, you can bet that every cable network news and every social media outlet on the planet, everybody's going to be tweeting and posting and asking, what is this and what could it mean? Every astronomer will be on television. They'll be calling every government agency to find out what's going on, because this kind of thing just doesn't normally happen. It didn't happen back then either. And it's led to a great deal of speculation through the years, like, how can we explain this? What natural human explanations could there be? And through the years, people have theorized different answers to this. I mean, one of the things in this part of the world that happens sometimes is you get these huge dust storms, the Khamsin storms. They come in from the east across the great deserts, and they blow into Jerusalem, and they can get so high in the atmosphere, 30, 40,000 feet and above, with these massive sandstorms that they can block out the sun. And so people have speculated, well, maybe that's what that is, but I think the gospel writers would understand a dust storm. And so the predominant theory through the years has been based on a more common astronomical event, but the people who make this observation obviously demonstrate their lack of knowledge of astronomy. And that is to say, the most common explanation is this picture you see here, which is a solar eclipse. A few years ago we had this. This is a picture from that big event. And a solar eclipse is a phenomenon in which it does get dark, so to speak, in the middle of the day. There's a few problems, though. Scientifically, it's not possible, because a solar eclipse requires a new moon. And the Passover happens in a full moon. So it can't be that. The other reason is because it says it lasts 3 hours. Eclipses don't last that long. They last 7 minutes and 31.1 seconds. I think somebody counted. In other words, what we're talking about here is not a natural phenomenon. There is something supernatural that's happening as Jesus in this moment is on the cross, starting at noon and then all the way to 3 o'clock. Now, you would think that if there was an event like this, people would have been talking about it. If it was happening today, people would be talking about it. So surely somebody would have said something about it. In the 2nd century, one of the leaders of the early church in Rome was a man named Tertullian. He's called by theologians as the first of the great fathers of the Western church. Tertullian was a fantastic Christian writer and thinker, and he had access to something we don't. He had access to the history books of the Roman Empire. And Tertullian says that written in the annals of Roman history is the recording of this event. And he points to 2 ancient Roman sources, a man named Thallus from the 1st century and a man named Phlegnon of Tralles. I wish they would give them like modern names so I'd know how to pronounce them better. But both of these individuals mention the darkness. And it points to the fact that this event that happened there wasn't just observed there, but it was an event that was recognized in history. And people were scratching their heads going, what's going on? This has got to be significant. What is the meaning of this moment? And that's what the gospel writer wants us to be thinking about. And then, at the end of that period of darkness, Jesus cries out. Somebody called it the cry that was heard around the world. And indeed, thousands of years later, here we are still reading and thinking about the cry of Jesus from the cross. The gospel writers record 7 sayings from the cross. Here we have only one of Jesus is in Mark's gospel. It is him saying, and Mark writes this as Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. The Aramaic was the language of people in Jerusalem. Jesus, however, was probably quoting this from the Hebrew text. There in the temple, at this moment, they were reading the 22nd Psalm. And Jesus quotes the beginning of the 22nd Psalm, which we can put here on the screen. Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? This is called the Psalm of the righteous sufferer. It is a psalm in the Old Testament that comes just before Psalm 23, the most famous of the Psalms, in which the psalmist is suffering for what they do not deserve. And the psalm begins with this sense of anguish. God, why are you so far away from my pain? Why are you letting me be in this moment, in this anguish? Why are you letting me go through this? Now, the fact that Jesus probably quotes it in Hebrew is recorded, by the way, in Matthew's gospel, is important because Eli is the way it's pronounced in Hebrew, is the beginning of one of the most famous names of the Bible, Elijah. Elijah was the famous prophet who was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire, and it was thought from time to time God might just send him down to come and rescue you from some difficult situation or another that you might face. There was a legend in the Jewish holy book called the Talmud in which a man named Eleazar was at the hands of the Romans, and he needed rescue, and God sent Elijah down and whisked him away 400 miles away and saved him. Now, there's no corroboration or evidence that this event really took place. But it was the kind of thing undoubtedly the crowd was aware of, and so when they hear him crying out, Eli, Eli, they think maybe he's crying out for help. So they say, let's give him something to drink, keep him alive a little bit longer, and let's see if Elijah shows up. But they're doing it as a mockery of him. They don't believe he's going to show up. The phrase, the cry heard around the world, is actually in the Bible. It's recorded in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 46. The prophet Jeremiah, of course, writes during the time of Israel's greatest failure, the destruction of Jerusalem, the conquering of the Babylonian Empire. And it says, the earth will shake with a shout, Babylon has been taken. And its cry of despair will be heard around the world. It's the moment of God's vindication and salvation of his people from the Babylonian exile. There will be a cry heard that God will come to the rescue. Well, you know, the 22nd Psalm starts by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And those of us in life who've been in difficult circumstances, we understand that kind of thing. The feeling like, God, you're so far away. But I want you to understand today that the 22nd Psalm doesn't end like that. The 22nd Psalm, although it begins with the feeling that God is so far away and he's forsaken us, it ends with a confident belief that he is righteous and he will be vindicated. And as Jesus is hanging there on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We need to remember that in all of his humanity and all that the cross has brought upon him, in that excruciating, literally out of the cross experience, he knows and believes that God will do through this experience exactly what is his will and purpose, and that Jesus will be vindicated. And so as the headline would read, darkness at midday and the cry heard round the world, everyone standing there, and we 2,000 years later are asking another question. Every good news journalist would want to know the answer to this. Why? What does it mean for him to die? If I could put it very eloquently, very theologically, very sophisticatedly, I'd say it like this. His death did something. Think about that for a moment. His death did something. The people standing around there in that moment didn't understand it. But it did something. In fact, the gospel tells us that literally, as he's dying in the holiest place in the temple of Jerusalem, the veil or curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, the most holy place in all of Israel's faith and on the planet, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, which was supposedly the symbolic presence of God, what in Hebrew is called his Shekinah glory would rest in this place. It was separated by a curtain in which no one was ever allowed to enter except for one man on one day out of every year. The high priests on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, could go behind the veil and could plead mercy on behalf of the people. And there, this veil, this curtain is ripped. And as you can see it in this picture, this beautiful ornate curtain. We know what it looked like. It was designed with Babylonian-style patterns. It was covered in fine garment. It was a fine garment with gold and other things to it. And it was torn from the top to the bottom. Now, the author of Hebrews, when Hebrews is writing, he is writing to explain what all this kind of stuff means. And he just puts it succinctly in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 20. In the middle of his thought, he says this. He says, by a new and living way opened up for us through the curtain, that is his body. Here, the author of Hebrews is talking about how Christ, through his death on the cross, and in this moment, he is making a way where there was no way before. What was previously the curtain, the unapproachable presence of God, has now been opened up so that God's presence is now accessible to his people. It says in the 9th chapter, you just peel back one chapter in the book of Hebrews, now the first covenant had, we call that the Old Testament. They called it the first covenant. Had regulations for worship, and it had an earthly sanctuary. It had a tabernacle was set up. Think the Israelites in the wilderness, you know. In its first room, there was a lampstand and a table with consecrated bread, and this was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense. It had a gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. Just think, Raiders of the Lost Ark. This ark contained the gold jar of manna. Remember the Israelites in the wilderness didn't have anything to eat? And God would send manna from the sky. Aaron's staff's there. Remember Moses using Aaron's staff to part the Red Sea and deliver Israel out of Egypt? His staff is there, and it budded. It's still alive. And the stone tablets of the covenant, remember these are the second edition because the first ones got broken when he came down the mountain. This is 2.0. And above the ark, if you were to look at it, were the cherubim of glory. The cherubim are creatures mentioned in the Old Testament book of Isaiah. They have wings. They're not actually angels. They're cherubim in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for cherubim is cherubim. And they're creatures that stand above the ark in glory and overshadowing the atonement cover. And the Hebrews is going on to describe, okay, there's this thing, there's this place, there's this holy place. Nobody can go into it, but God, through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, has ripped open the veil because he is saying the death of Jesus is doing something. Now those of you who are far away from God, Paul says it like this in Ephesians, you are now brought near through the blood of Jesus Christ. The wall that had separated you from God because of your sin, the impossible chasm that couldn't be crossed, he has crossed it through his death. His death is doing something. This is something that this gospel wanted you to know from its opening scene. The Gospel of Mark starts with a story about Jesus' baptism. And in that story, it uses the same word that's used here, torn open. Mark chapter 1, verse 9, it says, at that time Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee, and he was baptized by John. Remember the scene of John and Jesus? It says, and he was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven open. He saw heaven being torn open. That's the same word, ripped open. The Old Testament, so Lord, that you would rend the heavens and come down. Oh God, that you would just rip open the sky, that you would reveal your presence. You would reveal what was otherwise unseen. He saw heaven torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven. This is the voice of the Father to Jesus the Son. You are my Son, whom I love, the language of Abraham and Isaac on the Mount Moriah, my beloved. And with you, I am well pleased. The gospel has started with a story of God ripping open his presence, saying, I want to show you who I am. And at the cross, as he's dying, God is ripping open his presence to say, this is who I am. And then we see another thing that happens at the death of Jesus. You can see it here in this picture. This is, of course, an artist's rendition of a Roman centurion. The centurion, we get the word century from that. Century to us is 100 years, but a century was the backbone of a Roman military. It consisted of about 80 soldiers, not 100. It's a little bit of a round number when we go up. The man who was in charge of it was the highest ranked non-commissioned officer in the Roman military. They were highly trained, educated. They were experienced officers. And this man was in charge of overseeing the execution of Jesus. There were other soldiers there, but he was in charge, and he was there making sure it was done, and it was done until it was done. And there we see that Jesus dies, and a Roman soldier is standing there. And the Roman soldier looks up and he says this, as he watched and saw how Jesus died. He said, surely this man was the Son of God. Now that's the way the gospel essentially ends in so many ways. The life of Jesus ends. It ends with the scene of a Roman soldier standing there and saying, hey, this guy was the Son of God. Now that's an incredible statement. Because as you look around the crowd there that day, nobody else is saying, surely this man was the Son of God, right? The Jewish leadership were not saying that. I mean, even Jesus' followers, where were they? They weren't saying, surely this man was the Son of God. They were either looking on with horror from a distance or they were hiding out in an upper room. But here this Roman soldier says, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, it's interesting because if you think about it, this Gospel of Mark was written by a guy named John Mark, whose mom owned the upper room in Jerusalem where the early church met, where Peter and others had gathered. And later, we read in the Bible that Mark would join Peter and Paul in Rome, where they would be eventually killed under Nero in the 60s. And afterwards, Mark would have written down this gospel based on the memoirs of Peter. So what's incredible is to think about the fact that Mark is writing this down based on the memoirs of Peter, and he's writing it primarily to a church in the city of Rome, made up almost entirely of Gentiles. So the first people to have heard him read this gospel, or to have read this gospel, and they get all the way to the end. And just imagine you're sitting there in that Roman church, and you're a Gentile, and you're just wondering, could Jesus really love you? And you come to the end of that story, and the only person to recognize Jesus for who he truly was a Roman soldier in charge of his execution. It's staggering. It's staggering that Mark would make the hero of this gospel a Gentile. A person who's supposedly really far from God and has no hope of salvation. Jesus Christ was dying for them, and the one that recognized it was the Roman soldier. Now, this gospel was written so that we would know this. In Mark chapter 8, Peter said, "You're the Messiah." And in Mark chapter 9, Jesus took him up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And it says in Mark 9:7, "And then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my Son.'" Everybody should know this. The voice of heaven said, "This is the Son of God, whom I love. Listen to him." But at the cross, it is only a Roman soldier who recognizes it. The gospel was written for us to know this. We know that because of the opening verse of the gospel, Mark 1:1. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. This whole gospel was written to tear open the reality of who God is. It's to show us who Jesus Christ is, the Son of God. And we don't know it until we get to the cross. You don't know Jesus, the Son of God, until you come to the moment of his death. And then you see him for who he truly is. And Mark calls this the good news. We wonder, is this story newsworthy? This is the only story that is ever called in the Bible the good news. We're going to hear a lot of news in our lifetime. This is the good news. Euangelion in Greek, the good news. This is good news. We call it Good Friday, not because it was good for Jesus, he was dying, but it's good for us. The message is that this day God has opened up the way for us to have access to him, and he's revealed himself to us so that now those of you who are far from God can come near to him. But there's something you have to do. There's something you have to believe. And it's what the Roman soldier recognizes. You have to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It is the distinguishing mark of the Christian faith. Muslims believe in Isa, Jesus. They just don't believe he's the Son of God. Many Jews throughout history have believed that Jesus was a great figure of history. They just don't believe he's the Son of God. The thing that defines the Christian faith and whether or not you are a Christian today is whether or not you believe what a Roman soldier said in Mark chapter 15 on this day, where the headline reads, "Jesus dead. Is he the Son of God for you?" The Bible says that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. That's our belief today. Would you pray with me? Father, it is entirely possible for us to know every bit of this story, maybe even be able to get up here and preach this or share this. Or it's possible that we've heard it 1,000 times before. It's entirely possible that we've done those things, but we still don't believe. What distinguishes us as Christians is whether or not we actually believe it, and whether or not we are willing to put our faith and confession into the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. There were a lot of people, Lord, that day in Jerusalem that were watching. They were in the crowd. Some were critics. Some were compassionate. But there was only one man, a centurion, who made the good confession. Lord, may it be true of each one of us in this room and everyone watching right now that we could mark the moment in our life when we have made the good confession, when we have said, Jesus Christ is the Son of God who came to save me, who died for me, who took the penalty of my sin on himself so that I could have eternal life.